So, excuse me. Following this invasion that I talked about during the last episode, it specifically concerned Ethiopia, which is a country. It's a country it's in Africa, and at this point, Ethiopia was also ruled by an emperor, and he would actually become famous in leading the defense against Mussolini's um, army. And so the reason, the rationale behind this invasion, Mussolini wanted to. There was a lot of rhetoric. What you see in politics of any kind, but specifically in politics of a totalitarian state, in a fascist regime, you see much rhetoric, a promise to change, a promise to change the nation, to make it strong again, to look into its roots, into its history, into its national pride, into the civic duty of its citizens, and specifically what Mussolini promised to the Italian people. Um, he wanted to create a new Roman Empire, and it's a huge promise. The Roman Empire, why many people today are still so fascinated with the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire. It was an empire before its time. There would not be a nation state or an empire like the Roman Empire in thousand, 2,000, in thousands of years. It had technology so advanced that when the Roman Empire collapsed, because it became too big and it expanded too much, and this corruption on the inside finally rotted it away, and it just couldn't support its legions anymore. When the countries that the Roman Empire had formerly expanded into, and after it collapsed, when these Gauls, when these barbarians that we call, what we call barbarians, what they would call barbarians, what we would just call, the Gauls, or people in France, the people in France, and they would see these aqueducts. They would see these huge towering aqueducts, and it'd be like, well, what are these things? The Romans, they had these great infrastructure projects, and they also kind of invented the steam engine. They actually, one of the great minds, the great scientific minds, inventive minds of that age, he kind of made a little model of a steam engine. What would happen is there would be a little like spindle with a little bulb at one end that would be filled with water. And I'm really getting off topic now, but what he would do is he would light a fire underneath the spindle, and it would just make the spindle go around and around as the fire kind of ignited the water. Fire ignited the water. The fire turned the water into steam, evaporated the water, and the steam kind of just powered a little spinning thing at the top. And I don't actually know about the specifics of that apparatus, but it was the steam engine. It was the steam engine thousands of years in advance, right? And so um, that is pretty much the Roman Empire. And what Mussolini wanted to do was to turn his kind of second rate power into this preeminent Roman Empire. It's a huge promise. This is at October 1935. 1935. Meanwhile, in Germany, a guy named Adolf Hitler, you may have heard of him, becomes the quote unquote the Chancellor of Germany, and this is in 1933. So 2 years before the invasion of Ethiopia, and well, Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, and the story behind Adolf Hitler. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you listening, however many of you listening today, know like quite a few tidbits of information about Adolf Hitler because he's kind of mythologized in history as one of the worst leaders of all time. Killer of millions of people, and it just leads to our fascination with him. A lot of you know, obviously, that he didn't get accepted into an art school, and so a lot of revisionists, or not revisionists, but like alternative history, like what if scenarios. Hitler got accepted into that art school. One of his paintings could just be hanging in a cottage, hanging perhaps in your house. He could have been one of the greats. We would remember him in the same way that we remember Monet or just all the painters that I even, um, just some of the great painters, I suppose. Perhaps he'd just be one of those cozy little like tea house painters, just hanging in your tea shops or something. But instead, he becomes the leader of Germany, and he leads something called the Nationalist Socialist Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, and he begins a program to quote unquote purify Germany of the Jews, to whom he whom he like attributed responsibility to their defeat in World War One. He regarded them as the quote unquote the inferior race of Germany, and this is completely ridiculous, right? It's absolutely baseless. As we all know, um, many of the commanders during World War One, the very able German commanders were not Jewish at all. Neither were the politicians. Of course, all it takes are a few, and then Adolf Hitler instantly attributes, the loss of World War One to the Jewish people, which was absolutely incredibly dumb. A lot of Germans believe that back then, of course, I'm not sure about now, though there are neo-Nazis in Germany. A lot of Germans back then believed that the war was lost by their politicians, that Germany wasn't actually losing. And you have to give Germany, the credit, or credit is due. Their army during the First World War, was the most modern and well-equipped and capable and, outstanding military in the world. Many of their tactics were replicated in the Second World War to better effect, but that was a little bit, too little, too late during the closing stages of the war. But regardless, as you all may have already known, many of the Germans, they were the worldwide depression, because the depression that kind of the United States almost started led to a worldwide ripple where every single state enacted tariffs in response to the United States' tariff. And so it just became this terrible, vicious cycle of the closing of world trade right when the world needed it the most. Germany was at the very bottom of this, or the very middle, the very middle of this vicious cycle. And the Germans still had their war debts, their reparations, right? And it was said that nearly about somewhere around half of Germany's national population was unemployed. So we just have all these disgruntled, Germans wandering the streets, looking for something to do, hating the democratic government, hating whatever, because they were in miserable situations, and it's hard to blame them, because the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany wasn't really even invited to the table. It wasn't really even given any say in the terms. The end of the First World War, it was called an armistice, but it was really more like unconditional surrender. Germany it was just unconditional surrender. Germany didn't have any say in it. It was a mistake. The Treaty of Versailles was a huge mistake, but this mistake would lead to Hitler's rise, because in times of turmoil, you see a lot of people turning away from democratic nations because they feel that these democratic nations are too weak to lead in these times of crisis, or that they attribute the crisis itself, to the democratic nations. Just kind of human nature. Same with the election of our presidents. If you see, on the surface, on the superficial level, it may seem like the presidents to be blamed for economic crises, but the machinations, the wheels of economics are far beyond what many ordinary people can see. So at this point, Hitler comes to power. And in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles, he began a military buildup once again. And you have to understand how powerful the appeal, the allure of Hitler really was during that period of time. If I were a citizen, if I were a German living, probably not a Jew, but if I were a German living in Germany during that time period, I would absolutely love Hitler. He would be the best guy ever, because what he did worked, right? And that's the crazy thing. He wasn't just a jargonistic, like power hungry, Reichstag burning, statesman, or for lack of a better word, for a leader, right? His economic policies actually worked. And the reason why, it's almost like Keynesian spending. He just built the military. He built the industrial capacity, and all this building, right? all this infrastructure and all this specifically military infrastructure, or really focused on military infrastructure, all this building led up to more jobs. Suddenly, those one half of Germany, those 50% of people wandering the streets suddenly had something to do, and they had a purpose in life. What Hitler did was he gave them purpose, just like how David gave, purpose to his followers in the biblical stories, and they adored him for it. In the same way, it's a bit controversial comparing King David to the Führer Adolf Hitler, but the similarity they share, they gave their followers purpose, and the followers in return gave him near absolute loyalty. So in 1938, Hitler rolled his tanks into Austria, the former Austro-Hungarian Empire during the First World War, and now it was just a shadow of its former self. And he declared that Germany and Austria had a union. Now, there were a lot of native Germans in Austria. If you look back in history, and even geographically, they're very close, and a lot of ethnic Germans in Austria. The national language of Austria was German, and Hitler himself was born in Austria, on the borders between Austria and Germany, and so they were very close in culture and language and beliefs and things like that. They were allies in the First World War, so even though allies kind of they're more like that. Austria was at one point, a German politician said that Germany had, quote, binded itself with a corpse, and that Austria's military prowess left much to be desired. They were more of a burden than a help, much like Mussolini would become in the Second World War. It's really unfortunate that Germany just, while very militaristically outstanding herself, always manages to pick the bad allies. But this union, it made a lot of European nations, particularly Great Britain and France, uneasy about what was happening. But at the same time, they were in no position to really intervene. Because again, the Great Depression bogged everyone down. The Great Depression made every nation focus upon itself. It was like a huge collective dark age for the world. Nobody was cosmopolitan or globalized at this point. Everyone was just concerned about how are we going to deal with the discontent or the malcontents within our borders. And so France and Great Britain largely ignored him. And so in 1938, almost 1940, in the same year, Hitler declares his determination to take the Sudeten land, part of Czechoslovakia, and it contained 3 million ethnic Germans. And again, at this point, it didn't really matter to to Great Britain and to France, because they had their own problems. The Prime Minister of France, or of Great Britain, was a man named Neville Chamberlain, and he's one of the most infamous figures in world history because of his weak-willed and his policy of appeasement. If we appease Hitler, maybe he'll be satisfied. If we appease him, maybe he'll go away. It's kind of like the ostrich of Great Britain. And so, in order to avoid war, and the Prime Minister of France is a man named Édouard de Clède, or something like that. I'm very sorry. I have no ability to speak anything that is in English or Chinese. But the Prime Minister of France, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, the Prime Minister of Italy, or rather the leader of Italy, Benito Mussolini, and obviously Adolf Hitler, met in September 19th, 1938, in Munich, Germany, to ultimately surrender to Hitler's demands to take the Sudeten land. So, FDR actually applauded Chamberlain for having secured, quote, peace in our time, end quote. And many people look back on this quote today as terribly ironic. Peace in our time, how wishful. And even though hindsight is 2020, it's really hard to look favorably upon Chamberlain and Yolande de Guerre, or the Prime Minister of France, um, because everyone knows if you just give the aggressor, the terrorist, so to speak, what they want, they'll just simply take more. They'll expect that from here on out. Like, where do you stop? I mean, if they were so weak in the beginning, it just boils down to rudimentary human psychology, not even complex, like Freudian, like subconscious behaviors. It's really just basic human nature. So, and this "peace in our time" quote is hilariously misconstrued in this point in time. Many people today just, I mean, even the phrase "peace in our time" is associated ironically. You can't really keep a straight face while saying that. You'll have to roll your eyes a little bit just to signify how deluded and futile that effort really was. And the Munich Pact, it was in Munich after all, so a very creative naming scheme, was signed by the four nations, and it simply agreed that Germany could keep her acquired territories, and in return, there would be no war. No country wanted war except Germany, I suppose, and Italy secretly, and well, not even very secretly. The invasion of Ethiopia. And the thing about the invasion of Ethiopia, the Ethiopians were not European. Obviously, they were Ethiopian, which meant they were African, and there was still this kind of ethnic purity, this racism and this kind of like social Darwinism that was still lingering, or even like still very pronounced at this point in time. I'm not one to be deluded enough to say that it was lingering. There was still, let's say, rampant racism, within the world. And so if Italy were to invade, like, let's say, Spain, which they wouldn't, because Italy did not have the capability to take Spain, and also Spain would become fascist later on. If Italy were to invade a European nation, that would be war. That would be instant condemnation and expulsion from the League of Nations. But they invaded instead Ethiopia, and they just invaded this perceived backwards and uncivilized nation, right? And they invaded, just black people, African people, people who had no civilization and no culture and no nuance and no, it didn't really matter. And it was absolutely terrible. There were a few grumblings in the League of Nations, but ultimately no one did anything. And you can't really blame Neville Chamberlain and whatever the French Prime Minister's name was too much, because it's kind of a collective worldwide effort to just ignore these naked acts of aggression, and Italy's rationale, which also you can't really even blame Italy too much. Of course, there's always some blame to go around. But at what point should Italy draw the line? There was the scramble for Africa, which happened earlier on, and since Italy was late to the game, they wanted their own little piece of Africa. One thing though, Ethiopia was called the citadel of Christianity. It was actually one of the few African nations that was not Muslim, or else a native, African, the various African beliefs and spiritualities and like religions. They were actually Christian, so that kind of narked a few people in the West, let's say, who because the West was predominantly, as you know, Christian, either Catholic or Protestant, and beside that small note, that small misgiving, let's say, the invasion was successful. Though, funny thing though, that even though the Ethiopians were hugely outgunned and outnumbered, they still did a very good job of holding off the Italians. Even though the Italians should have had a absolute and decisive victory, they still managed to lose many troops. And they actually used poison gas, and they decided to test it on these Ethiopian defenders because there wasn't much press coverage in Ethiopia, and they weren't really European. They weren't white. They weren't Anglo-Saxon. So they decided just to use it on these Ethiopians and see how it worked. Um, Even today, with the recent Putin's annexation of Crimea, which he calls a referendum, President Vladimir Putin's 98 percentile referendum for Crimea to join, Russia. Putin, uses the same reasons that Adolf Hitler. The parallels that have been drawn, um, one would have to admit, are strikingly, similar. The reason Putin used, the justification he used for this invasion was that there were a lot of ethnic Russians living in Crimea. In fact, there were more Russians in Crimea than there were not Crimeans, but Ukrainians, and that more people knew how to speak Russian, than Ukrainian. And so, he made that argument, and then he took it. He took it with, at first, not unarmed, but there was no identification of these Russian troops. And then he later unveiled that they were in fact Russian troops, and that they were taking Crimea, and it was just like that. And the parallels have been drawn. I'm not really sure what to make of it. I mean, it's very bad. Actually, I am sure what to make of it, but I can't go too much into that. I just want the audience to kind of know, you guys all to know, that the similarities are very, very striking. And now we know better, hopefully, and we've acted on it. We being the West, being not hopefully Neville Chamberlains, but rather Winston Churchill's and FDR's, even though FDR at this point kind of wanted peace, and so he closed his eyes and didn't really do anything. The sanctions, that's what I'm talking about. The sanctions, if it's interesting, if Great Britain and France sanctioned Germany and Italy for doing those things, if the world, including the United States, sanctioned, these nations, would world history have been different? Would Germany not be financially capable of waging a war against Poland, and then later against all of Europe, and then all of Russia, all of the Soviet Union? Would he be financially bankrupt? Well, I'd say no, for the simple reason that the world was in a depression, and that the trade going on was virtually non-existent. So it was almost like every country in the world was sanctioning every other country, also known as worldwide stalemate. So probably not. Meanwhile, in Japan, right? As if Germany, the situation in Europe wasn't bad enough, there was Japan. Japan was disgruntled after the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. And this is a common theme you see throughout this period in time. The aggressor nations being disgruntled with the status quo, disgruntled with the victors claiming their prizes, and then disgruntled with the environment, the economic environment. And so militarists gained control of the government and instantly turned Japan into an expansionist empire, just like that, blink of an eye. And while there isn't quite a figure like Mussolini or like Adolf Hitler, Japan had someone different. They had the emperor. It was the restoration of an emperor, the restoration of traditional Japanese beliefs and systems and governance. And the emperor, or rather the government, because the government was the main entity operating, the emperor was more of a figurehead, a spiritual figurehead to kind of guide his people in war. But it was really the Japanese imperial government that was obviously governing. Much like, the Queen of Great Britain being merely a figurehead, whereas Parliament, the British Parliament actually, the House of Commons and all that, they actually govern the Isle. But instead of, God save the Queen, there was this fanatic reverence for the Japanese emperor. And almost like the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, the emperor was deified as he's revered as a god. He was deified. And the Japanese children, school children, were indoctrinated at an early age, um, just like the school children in Germany and in Italy um, would be indoctrinated to follow um, the ideology of Nazism and Italian fascism, and Hitler made sure to tell his subordinates working in government, to indoctrinate the children at an early age because he needed supporters. He needed people who would follow him. And as you can see, in all terrible, maybe not, yeah, let's say terrible for all intents and purposes, but more accurate would be the word like rigidly controlled. You see in all these governments just an early indoctrination, early brainwashing, so to speak. There's been controversy surrounding the Pledge of Allegiance and how every American school child is taught the Pledge of Allegiance and taught to chant it in unison. And if a foreigner came to America, which there are a lot of those, and just walked into a school, into a classroom, saw all these children chanting the same lines at the same time over a loudspeaker, it'd be kind of an Orwellian vibe, but there's been a bit controversy surrounding that. But I digress. In a quest for raw materials, Japan decided to pursue an expansionist movement. In 1931, Japan sent in troops to the northern Chinese province of Manchuria, and it took 2 years, but they finally had Manchuria. And then later on, in 1937, after signing political treaties and was of political alliance and mutual defense with Germany and Italy, Japan dropped all pretenses and declared full war against China. Before Japan joined up, it was just the Berlin-Rome axis, the capitals of Germany and Italy, respectively. And it was just kind of a gesture, but later on it became more serious of, hey, you're fascist. They didn't call it that. You're totalitarian. We're totalitarian. Why don't we get together and be totalitarian together? Why don't we get together and be fascist together? Because it wasn't just totalitarian, because Stalin was totalitarian, right? But you could argue he wasn't quite fascist. The ideological beliefs of the Soviet Union was still strictly socialist, although it became more and more less so as time went on. And there was actually some talk later on in a war about the Soviet Union joining the Axis powers, the Berlin-Rome axis, now the Berlin-Rome-Tokyo axis, and soon, or potentially, the Berlin-Rome-Moscow-Tokyo axis. And that would have been horrible, and also potentially the end of the war.